Okay, hello everybody and welcome back to another study, the Trim and Burning study in the book. We are in 1 Samuel. We're actually getting close to the end. We're going to be in 1 Samuel chapter 30 tonight. But again, we're just studying the Bible as God's Word. We're going right through, from I keep talking about how I went from Genesis all the way to 1 Samuel. And we're going right through the book. We're in the 9th book of the Bible. We are in the history books in 1 Samuel. Like I said, we're finishing up 1 Samuel and we'll enter 2 Samuel in a few weeks, whenever we will get to that. But remember, these are all one scroll, but you can see why we have them divided into 1 and 2 Samuel. It's a nice clean cut transitioning in from Saul to David, you'll see. But that's where we're at here in the history books, working our way through the Old Testament narrative. So just to give you an idea in the time period, we're around 1000 BC right now. I haven't done that in a while. I used to love giving like time frames here. Right, so we are around 1000 years BC, which means 1000 years before Christ was born, 1000 years before the New Testament was even, written. Right, so that's the time period we are currently in as we move through. And of course, Esther ends around 400-ish BC, 440, somewhere in there BC, and then that's where the intertestamental period is. But that's where we're at, around 1000 BC, give or take some years. So remember, we are in the Saul-David saga. I'm just going to pick back up in a review from chapter 23 to catch us up. So remember, Saul, of course, pursued David, even though he wasn't the enemy, after saving Keilah. And David, kind of generously spared Saul's life when he could have killed him. Remember in the caves of En-Gedi? And it's neat to see in this whole book how God has just been, what today they would call synchronicities, but it's actually God ordaining, orchestrating things, because again, what were the odds that Saul would have went to this cave to relieve himself, where David and his men were hiding. But you could see, God's divine providence through all this. David let him go, and then of course afterwards Saul had lied and said, I will never follow you again. You're going to be king. I'm going to back off. And of course, Saul is fickle, and he continued to pursue David, as we had learned. And then David spared him again. This time not in a cave. This time he actually went down to him. Remember, it's kind of the same outcome, but the story was a little bit different. This time they went down to his camp. They could have killed him, but they didn't. And then he shouted from him from afar, where the first time he actually bowed down right close to him. That was to show that David's lack of trust in Saul was growing, which of course it should, right? Because Saul is a crazy man, and he's been trying to kill David. I think he took 16 or 17 assassination attempts on David. So you can see why I wouldn't trust Saul either. And that's what happened there. Then this is where the story started to really take a downturn for David. And this is really going to tie in again to where we're at tonight. So in 1 Samuel chapter 27, remember that David fled to Achish again, because he had gone before, but last time he went alone and he pretended to be a crazy man because he's afraid they were figuring out who he was, right? Now he came to Achish and the Philistines. This time was different, because now he had a band of brothers, right? He had 600 men with him. They had conquered people, so now he's not alone in a dark alley anymore. And he approached Achish and the Philistines to live with them, which is really sad. He's kind of defecting. But if you remember in 1 Samuel 27, the reason he did this is he said, this is the only way I'm going to get Saul to stop chasing me. If I just go, I need to get away. I need to flee and run to Philistia. It's my only hope. And that was his plan. And it did work, right? Remember, it did say that Saul afterwards, you know what I mean? It could be like if you had to chase somebody and then they left the country, it's like, it's a lot of effort to go get them. At least they're out of my way now. And that's probably how Saul even saw it. Like, well, David's out of here now. I can be king again and not have to worry about him stealing my thunder. Because Saul is full of pride, right? But David in this moment, in 1 Samuel 27, remember, this is one of his worst chapters, maybe ever in the entire Bible, like I said, because he makes friends with the Philistines. He swears to work with Achish and with all this stuff. And then later on we'll know that he lied as well about some things. But it was a really low point in David's life where David actually shows signs of how we can be. David knew God's promises, remember? Even Saul knew God's promises. Samuel knew that David was going to be king of Israel, and God had promised that. Yet, David's like us, who can get in his head and say, you know what, maybe actually I'm supposed to, I don't know. Maybe I'm not going to be king. Maybe I should just go hide out and leave Israel, and maybe that's the best place for me. So he was really down in the dumps, right? He was not excited like, hey, I know I'll be king, and I'll go back one day. I'm just going to go for a little bit, and I'll go back be king. You didn't see that positive language. It was very negative, and I mean, just imagine trying to avoid assassination attempt after assassination attempt. It would just feel exhausting, right? So we understand why he felt like that, but he was starting to maybe not, I don't know if he doubted God's promises, but they were not at the forefront of his mind anymore. He was not clinging to God's promises. He was kind of in deep depths of despair, and that can happen to any believer. We have promises of God for our own lives, yet sometimes we can feel helpless, and maybe I shouldn't even be doing this, maybe, and we can get down in the dumps. So you can see how mentally it's really important. That's why, God's word is our daily bread, and we should be praying without ceasing, the Bible says, right? Because we have to keep our minds in the game of God's promises and what he said. David, his bad moment came from no longer checking in with God, no longer asking God what he should do, and just kind of acting scared. But we can't blame him, because like I said, we would probably do something similar. And then, of course, the chapter got worse, because remember, David he got Ziklag. This is where he got his town of Ziklag down on the border, because he wanted to hide out, because he's going to do some nefarious things, right? Because remember, for a living, he didn't ask God to go kill them. He was killing the Israelites' enemies, right? He was killing them and seizing and with plunder and stuff like that. But that was just almost like as a job, right? And he was lying about it. He was killing women and all the men and children. He's killing everybody, so they couldn't go back and tell Achish that he was lying, right? Because he told Achish, the Philistine leader, hey, I'm taking out all the Israelites for you. I'm taking out all my former buddies. But really, he was helping Israel, killing all the enemies that God had told Israel to kill. Problem was, David didn't ask God about this, and he didn't do it in the right way, right? He was doing it for a living, right? Not because God commanded him. But he did. You could also see the pressure. There's a lot of things go into this. David had a lot of men to feed, which means a lot of wives, a lot of children, and a lot of animals. However, it's never right to sin to get what you need. And this, that's why I say this is one of his darkest moments. And then again, I have these maps because they're very helpful when you're reading the Bible. That all happened down in the southwest region of Israel, where it's actually, like I keep reminding you guys, Gaza, all the chaos going on today in Israel, it's actually the same location, very similar land area of where that part of the story, about 24 through 27, those chapters took place. And then the last two chapters we covered, remember 1 Samuel 28, this really sets the scene for the end of 1 Samuel. Saul fears the Philistine army, and this will be, we know, the Philistine army that it brings Saul's demise. But he saw the army coming up, and he was afraid. And remember, that's because they were coming up north. They were so far away, right? It means they left Philistia, and they were doing an attack. And he saw this, and he was afraid, and he asked God, and he asked prophets, and there was no answer. There's no answer from God at all. And Saul was worried, so he had gone to see a medium or a witch at Endor who claimed to talk with spirits, and she was well known at Endor, even though Saul had banned them, right? He had banned them, which is a godly thing. We're not supposed to be messing with necromancers and seances and bringing the dead back, right? Because it is possible in some way, shape, or form, but it's not good to do. And Saul had that done. Samuel came up. You could argue it was a demon. I believe it was Samuel, though. A one-time occasion, something that doesn't happen often or maybe ever again. But God used this to kind of pronounce more judgment on Saul, and it was actually more terrifying than if he would have never even went to him. And Samuel basically tells him, why did you disturb me? But it's not going to be good for you. I already told you what God said. Why would you come to that? Samuel's spirit basically says, why would you come and ask me if God's not answering you? Why would I be able to help you, right? So that was a very interesting situation in that chapter. And then we went back into the whole Philistine David debacle. And David had gone so far down this mental despair that he was almost like, well, maybe I'm supposed to fight for the Philistines. Maybe I'm a Philistine now. Maybe I shouldn't go back to Israel. And he was actually, if you remember, marching north into Israel with the Philistines and Achish, right? He was marching north, so he was actually on an offensive attack and seemed pretty gung-ho about it until those men of Achish said, hey, wait a minute. Why is David and all of his men, these Israelites, these Hebrews with us? That's who we're going to fight, right? So, why are we taking the enemy with us to fight the enemy? In case they turn back on us, if he has to help his Lord, his God. And they were probably right, you know what I mean? If this would have went through, God would have intervened because he's going to keep his promises, right? And David would have still became king somehow. This is how God ordained it to be. And David, I believe God was speaking through those Philistines because that was David's way out. Otherwise, David, if you remember, David was upset that they didn't want him to fight. Hey, we got to kick David out of here. And Achish goes, hey, David, I don't want to get rid of you. I think you're great. I would have loved to have you as my bodyguard my entire life. But my guys, my commanders, my top generals don't really trust you. And they do a lot of my fighting and help me a lot. So you're going to have to go home. I'm sorry. And David's like, what do you mean? What did I do to you guys, right? And would you really do that if you didn't want to? You know what I mean? He almost reacted like, oh, I was ready to fight. I was ready to go to war. Why do they have a problem with me? And who knows, maybe this was also a pride thing with David. I don't know. But if you think of David, he was this warrior and killed all these men. Like, what do you mean you don't want me? I killed your champion. Why don't you want me? What did I do wrong, right? So he's in despair, but it was all divine, we saw. God was actually helping David out of a very bad predicament that could have ended in a lot more sin than he had already been in. So again, not a good thing, but we do find that at the end of that chapter, it was a shorter chapter, David and his men agree, and they say they're going to leave and go back. And here's that map of where it went. So again, remember, they were down all the way in Ziklag, so you can see southwest Gaza, where I just showed that first map. Now they're all the way up north, and you can see those red lines are showing the Philistines attacking up north, right? So this would be like Mexico below us, all of a sudden ending up in Nevada. You know what I mean? Like, whoa, hey, like, what are you guys doing up here? Like, so it was an offensive. It was an invasion, is what they were doing here. And that's why you see Ziklag. That was David's men joining, and the green arrow was Saul and the Israel army. They were heading north because actually he was down near Jerusalem in Gibeah there, and he went north because he knew that's where the war was going to happen. It was taking place. That's why, remember, Endor was up north. That's why he saw the witch of Endor, because he was up there and she happened to be in that region, right? But he was going up there because he knew this mounting attack near Mount Gilboa up in Jezreel was going to take place. Ironically, if you really want to get technical, you can actually break this down. Megiddo is up there, is very near where that's at. And Megiddo is where we get the term Armageddon. The final battle in the Bible says will happen in that same region that this happened. So it's a pattern. There will be a war again, and Jesus will win a war in the same location that Saul will eventually get killed. But that's what was happening. That's why I want to show these maps, to give you a visual, because we can, like I said, we can read a lot of things, but to really I'm a visual learner, so I like having maps and know what's going on. So now everybody's migrated up north, and it was at Aphek. See that town right there? David didn't make it all the way up to Mount Gilboa. He got to Aphek, and that's where that whole thing, he got kicked out and had to turn around from home. So you can see how far he is from Ziklag, but they got all the way up to Aphek, and that's where we're going to pick up in chapter 30. So what we're going to do, as usual, we're going to go ahead and read through verse by verse in chapter 30, and then we'll go ahead and break it down. All right, chapter 30 starts. Now when David and his men came to Ziklag on the third day, the Amalekites had made a raid against the Negeb and against Ziklag. They had overcome Ziklag and burned it with fire, and taken captive the women and all who were in it, both small and great. They killed no one, but carried them off and went their way. And when David and his men came to the city, they found it burned with fire, and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive. Then David and all the people who were with him raised their voices and wept until they had no more strength to weep. David's two wives also had been taken captive, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. And David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because all the people were bitter in soul, each for his sons and daughters. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. And David said to Abiathar the priest, the son of Ahimelech, "Bring me the ephod." So Abiathar brought the ephod to David, and David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I pursue after this band? Shall I overtake them?" He answered him, "Pursue, for you shall surely overtake, and shall surely rescue." So David set out, and the 600 men who were with him, and they came to the brook Besor, where those who were left behind stayed. But David pursued, he and 400 men. 200 stayed behind, who were too exhausted to cross the brook Besor. They found an Egyptian in the open country, and brought him to David. And they gave him bread, and he ate. They gave him water to drink, and they gave him a piece of cake of figs and 2 clusters of raisins. And when he had eaten, his spirit revived, for he had not eaten bread or drunk water for 3 days and 3 nights. And David said to him, "To whom do you belong? And where are you from?" He said, "Well, I'm a young man of Egypt, servant to an Amalekite, and my master left me behind because I fell sick 3 days ago. We had made a raid against the Negeb of the Kerethites, and against that which belongs to Judah, and against the Negeb of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag with fire." And David said to him, "Will you take me down to this band?" And he said, "Swear to me by God that you will not kill me or deliver me into the hands of my master, and I will take you down to this band." And when he had taken him down, behold, they were spread abroad over all the land, eating and drinking and dancing. because of all the great spoil they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from the land of Judah. And David struck them down from twilight until the evening of the next day, and not a man of them escaped, except 400 young men who mounted camels and fled. David recovered all that the Amalekites had taken, and David rescued his 2 wives. Nothing was missing, whether small or great, sons or daughters, spoil or anything that had been taken. David brought back all. David also captured all the flocks and herds, and the people drove the livestock before him and said, "This is David's spoil." Then David came to the 200 men who had been too exhausted to follow David and who had been left at the brook Besor. And they went out to meet David and to meet the people who were with him. And when David came near to the people, he greeted them. Then all the wicked and worthless fellows among the men who had gone with David said, "Because they did not go with us, we will not give them any of the spoil that we have recovered, except that each man may lead away his wife and children and depart." But David said, "You shall not do so, my brothers. With what the Lord has given us, he has preserved us and given into our hand the band that came against us. Who would listen to you in this matter? For as his share is who goes down to the battle, so shall his share be who stays by the baggage. They shall share alike." And he made a statute and a rule for Israel from that day forward to this day. When David came to Ziklag, he sent part of the spoil to his friends, the elders of Judah, saying, "Here's a present for you from the spoil of the enemies of the Lord." It was for those in Bethel, in Ramoth the Negeb, in Jatir, in Aroer, in Sifmoth, in Eshtemoa, in Rakal, in the cities of the Jerahmeelites, in the city of the Kenites, in the Hormah, in Borashan, in Athak, in Hebron, for all the places where David and his men had roamed. All right. Let's go back and recap. There's actually a lot going on there in those 31 verses. So we'll start with the first 15 here. It starts out, so of course, remember, David and his men are leaving. They left Aphek. They're dejected. They're upset they have to leave this war. And it says, when David and his men came to Ziklag on the 3rd day, the Amalekites had made a raid against the Negeb and against Ziklag. They had overcome Ziklag and burned it with fire and taken captive the women and all were in it, both small and great. So what's going on here is, remember that map on Aphek here, that's quite a distance. And it took 3 days. Now that distance is, I think, about 50 miles. So think of somewhere 50 miles from here. And they had to walk with all their baggage and the whole crew, all the guys and stuff. And it took them 3 days to walk. So, I mean, they're doing over 15 miles a day. And I'm a hiker. That's a good long day. That's like stopping for lunch and dinner and sleeping through the night. But you're booking it pretty much most of the day. 3 straight days. And you can imagine, they probably didn't plan for this trip. This trip was unplanned. So they're walking for 3 days south, back to their home. Probably didn't have enough food packed. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. But that's an exhausting walk. And as they finally get home, they see fire basically coming. And that was a common thing back then. You'll see in warfare all throughout the Bible, one of the things to do was to burn the cities, sometimes even sow it with salt. Sometimes you'd even throw salt on the city so nothing could ever grow again, so nobody could come back, because you need things to grow, to have food and all that stuff. So they used to do that kind of stuff. So this is a common thing when people would take over. But you can imagine, as they burn it with fire, you can imagine David and his men getting really close and seeing this smoke. I can just imagine this smoke billowing up and be like, wait a minute, like that's, I'm sure they got suspicious as they got closer with all this fire going on. And they end up finding out, of course, that the Amalekites took all the women and everybody, both small and great. Now, the key thing here, it says they killed no one, but carried them off and went away. So they basically took them hostage, right? And again, this is different, at least, than David. Remember, this is what's ironic, is I think in chapter 27, it talked about David. Remember those raids that he was doing against all those things? One of them, I believe, is the Amalekites. So he was doing this stuff to the Amalekites. It almost makes you wonder if this was retribution. That they were also, the Amalekites also weren't dumb, right? So they knew David and his men in Ziklag were doing all this stuff. The Amalekites were still around. And I'm sure they heard that there's a war going on up north. And the Philistines and Israel are going to have a real big battle up there. Which is just like somebody, if you're a thief or a robber, and your neighbors going to Florida for the week. Like, all right, cool, we have 7 days to get in and get out, right? It's basically how they thought. Like, well, they're going to be up north. They're going to be gone. We're going to go now. And it worked. The Amalekites were correct. They attacked when they were weak. The Philistines weren't around. And like, think how helpless it was. It was all the warriors are up north, all the defenders are up there. It's all the women and the children and the livestock. So in a way, Amalekites were being wise, and they were basically returning fire with fire, because David had actually, if you consider it, done this 3 chapters ago to them. So you can see maybe this is retribution. It doesn't say it for sure, but it makes sense if you put the details together. However, I love that it says they killed no one, and this is a divine thing, because back then, people were killing. And again, if this was retribution, the Amalekites know, according to that story, David was going in there and killing everybody in those towns and slaughtering them. So the Amalekites could have come in here and slaughtered them all up and left their dead bodies when they came back, right? Just like David probably did to the Amalekites, but they didn't. And I would again say, just like God spoke through those Philistines to say, get David out of here, perhaps it was God. It doesn't say explicitly, but I'm saying perhaps God intervened and said, we'll keep these people safe. Almost it was protection for the women. Not so much David as much as the women and the children who were there. They were not killed, and it's actually miraculous if you consider what has been going on these last few chapters. So it says, when David and his men came to the city, they found it burned with fire, and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive, which would make you sick, right? It's very similar to, what's going on over in Israel and Gaza. There's people still captured, and it would make you sick. Could you imagine if you knew one of your family members is alive, not even dead, but you're at least glad they're alive, but now every day you think about, well, these people aren't nice. They're not their friends. They're not going to be living in luxury. They're not going to be getting the best food. So you can imagine how sick you would be if one of your family members was taken captive. Now think of your helpless children and your wife, people who can't defend themselves. You'd feel really, really sick about it, right? And that's what had happened. Carried away, they saw that. Then David and the people who were with him raised their voices and wept until they had no more strength to weep, which is, again, natural reaction. Screaming out loud, shouting, probably in anger. It was probably a mixed emotions. You guys know how this goes. He's probably frustrated, wants to kill the Amalekites. They're all shouting. They also have anxiety. They're also sad. They're in turmoil. Their family's missing. It was a lot going on here. And you know how it goes in crisis, how people lose their minds sometimes. And there's not a lot of calm, right? And that's what's going on here, I'd imagine. It says David's 2 wives. You see, his wives were kidnapped. So David was, it says, was greatly distressed. And not only that, his family was, now look at this next line. He was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because all the people were bitter in soul, each for his sons and daughters. And that, again, would make sense to me. So David's disturbed and distressed and freaking out, but so are these people. And at the same time, they're like, David, I ought to kill you, David. You can imagine. And the things you say, have you ever been like, I'm sure it happens to us all the time when, you take a wrong turn or you end up lost or off track, and the pastor goes, I told you should have turned back there. Now we're going to be lost. And then now the next driver's like, well, if you wouldn't have done this. And the next thing you know, everybody's erupted in anger. And everybody was fine before, right? Everybody's fine. But now there's a problem. Now you're so mad. If you wouldn't have done this, I wouldn't be going through this, right? So you can imagine, we've all been there. We've all blamed people for, I can't believe. And you harp and harp on it, and you harp on it. And it's only this bitterness that comes out. And your trip would have been fine if you wouldn't have missed the turn, right? Would have been fine. Nobody would have blamed anybody, right? But these things happen, right? When bad things happen, or that broke, I told you not to ever touch that. I can't believe you. We've all been there, right? So you can imagine, and now it doesn't involve missing a turn or breaking a lamp that your grandmother made or something. It involves your children missing and your wife missing. And I bet you they were enraged. I bet guys were holding stones and shaking them in their hands, saying, let's go, everybody. Let's do it. So imagine David. David has now bottomed out. He has hit rock bottom, I'd say. Because he left Israel, he defected, he joined the Philistine army, they rejected him, so he feels dejected by the enemy, and then he comes down, and now his wife and children are kidnapped, his city that he had built up, which is like their nice little stronghold, that's burned, right? And all while, we are also good at, although we blame other people, don't forget, we are our worst critics too. A lot of times we don't talk about the things that we say in our heads to ourselves. I'm sure David's head was going nuts. I'm such an idiot. I can't believe I went to the Philistines. I can't believe I did all this. I got all these guys. Now they're going to kill me. And I'm never going to see my wives again. I can't believe I left. You can imagine his head is just going with all this turmoil, beating himself up, and literally bottomed out because he's got people who wants to kill him. His family's missing. The Philistines didn't even want to fight. And he caused this whole mess because he didn't listen to God. And I'm sure he's in his own head. And this is probably the worst David may have ever felt in his life. I don't know. But I'd imagine this is, other than maybe the whole Bathsheba thing, that he felt awful about that. But this one is awful because he's affected so many people. And again, I know David didn't want that. So that, like, could you imagine if somebody put you in charge of watching their kid and their kid got kidnapped? How you would feel, right? Now imagine all the kids you were supposed to be in watch got kidnapped, and all the women too. So, I mean, this is a sick feeling that he had to have. But I love what it says right there. So you see how he bottomed out and how he's distressed because they all want to kill him and everybody's gone. But I love how it ends that paragraph. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. And I think it goes to show you of what we all know. The Bible talks about is sometimes you need to be drained of everything you have. It kind of reminds me of, and it's a little bit different when Paul says, when I'm weak, I am strong because the Lord's power can work through me. And here, David's might has always been here and doing this. Now David has nothing, and he is emptied. He is spiritually bankrupt right now. And now he can finally say, God, I really need you. And he finally snaps out of it. And sometimes you know how this is. A lot of times people change their lives or come to Christ. Not all, but a lot of them because they've bottomed out. Because they're addicted and they don't want to be anymore. Because they've been failing at this and they don't want to do it anymore. They've lost everything. Their house is gone. Their job is gone. And that's when they finally reach out and they don't want to try doing it on their own anymore. And that's when God shows up, right? Because God's really the strength behind us all and why everything works out. We've seen here how God has ordained everything in this whole situation even. But David finally comes to the end of himself and says, I'm done, Lord. I'm done. I need your strength. And this is where it turns around. And it's like God had to make him go through all of this personal hell for him to finally realize he needed to rely on God. Because did you notice the past few chapters, we haven't seen David go to God at all for anything. He didn't go and say, hey, God, Saul's still trying to kill me. Should I go to the Philistines or not? Should I go to live with Achish or not? And then when he was there, he didn't say, hey, should I go up north and fight against Israel or should I not? You didn't see that because he was so lost in just being lost, right? And when you're lost and you're not focusing on God, you can go all over the place. And this is where David's life just became disheveled. Because he wasn't asking God about attacking those, doing those raids. He wasn't asking God about anything. And look where it ended up. This is what happens when you try to do your own things in your own way. It ends in destruction. It ends in absolute destruction. And the only way to fix that when you come to destruction, this is more proof. It's not the end of everything. You can always turn to God. And that's what David does. And then right from there, as you can see, he bottoms out, and now all of a sudden, things turn around. And David said to Abiathar, the priest, the son of Ahimelech, bring me the ephod. So Abiathar brought the ephod to David, and David inquired of the Lord, shall I pursue after this band, or shall I overtake them? He answered him, pursue, for you shall surely overtake, and shall surely rescue. So right here, we see David, after he bottoms out, and it says he gets his strength from the Lord. He's now re-strengthened. So that was supernatural, because why should David be strengthened at all if not for God's strength? Because he's in a pretty bad spot. But God gives David strength, and he says to Abiathar, which remember, Abiathar is the one who was the son, remember the priest Nob that David's sin had killed? Abiathar's dad got murdered because of David's lies, by the way. So that's more of this. But he has Abiathar, the priest now. He says, hey, go grab that ephod that you guys wear, which is probably from the high priest. This is the high priest from the old ephods, but there's a high priest one, and bring it here. And what's going on here again is that Urim and Thummim I've talked about before, almost like this divination dice. It would have been in the front pockets of the ephod. They would have got him out to ask God questions, which we don't use now, obviously, because Jesus is our high priest. So you don't need to do divination stuff and say, I need to go get my Urim and Thummim and ask God questions like the magic 8-ball, right? Don't do that. This was only, this is a thing before Christ came, what they did, and even afterwards, you never see the Urim and the Thummim and the ephod ever again in this way. But that's how they did it. That's how they inquired of God. This is the one way they could do this. So he went and asked God finally, and I think God would have answered him just like he answers here. God would have answered him all the other times he asked him, but he just never asked. But he asked him, should I pursue this band? He's finally got his head right. Like, hey, God, if I go there, am I going to be okay? Should I go after him and should I do this? And God says, yep, you shall surely do it, and you shall overtake and shall surely rescue. And what I love about this line here, like, it could have been a yes or no. It could have just been, yep, do it, right? Yes, go ahead, David, just go do it. But God does not just say yes. He does not answer it. He also offers this promise that can give you confidence and hope, because perhaps it could be discouraging going into these wars. Imagine if God's like, yep, go ahead, go fight. And you're not sure, but God here confirms, like, yep, go ahead. You're going to overtake and you shall surely rescue. That would be pretty, like, heartwarming to be like, wait a minute, I'm going to get my wives back. They're not going to be killed when I show up. And God's here saying, no, you go and attack. Not only that, it's going to be good. You're going to win, and you're actually going to rescue everybody. He says it right here. It's prophetic of what God says is going to happen. And I love that, and it's a good reminder to us that God's promises are for us, and sometimes we can forget God's promises, right? But God, what I love about it not only gives you action, but he always promises the outcome in the end ultimately, right? And that's what's amazing about this. He's giving him hope, just like the Lord gives us hope. No matter what we go through here, you have trust in Christ, and Christ is your Savior, and you've stopped trying to do it on your own, and just like David here, and said, Jesus, I can't earn this on my own. That's when he says, I'll save you, and not only that, I'll give you hope, and you'll have eternal life. God gives us this promise. We don't have to guess. Like God's like, yep, good, here, I'll help you. The Bible didn't just stop there. God, if you read the Bible, he promises all these things that we're all going to get in the future. And that's where we get our hope from. And this is how David got his hope here. So, of course, David listened to God, and this is a good thing. David set out, he takes all 600 men, remember all of his men that he's been fighting with. He hasn't lost one of them, by the way. And they came to the brook Besor, where those who were left behind stayed. But David pursued, he and 400 men, 200 stayed behind, who were too exhausted to cross the brook Besor. So you have 33% of the army now drop back. Remember, there's a 3-day walk, and don't forget, it was probably a 3-day walk up until they said, hey, turn around, and 3-day walk back. Like, could you imagine, like, driving to California? Like, hey, we're going to take a road trip to California, and by the time you hit Nevada, which is like one state over, they say, hey, guys, hey, we don't have any hotels for you. You're going to have to go home. Could you imagine that? Like, so they wasted a lot of energy trying to, and the battle, I'm sure there's anxiety. Like, we're going to have to fight the Israelites. We got to hype up. There's a lot of energy that goes into all this stuff. All to have to turn around and say, they're exhausted. A third of these guys are truly exhausted and said, listen, I can't go anymore. I've been 6 days at this. I don't know. If you send me, I'm going to get killed. I don't have the energy to lift my sword anymore, David. I got to stay here. I can't do this. So that's what happens here. 400 go and 200 stay behind is what we learn here. Then the story continues on. They found an Egyptian in the open country and brought him to David, and they gave him bread and he ate. They gave him water to drink, and they gave him a piece of cake of figs and 2 clusters of raisins. And when he had eaten, his spirit revived, for he had not eaten bread or drunk water for 3 days and 3 nights. So I like that this starts out. It's really interesting here. So they find this random Egyptian boy. And you're like, how does this play in? And of course we read how it plays in. But it starts out saying, hey, they find this guy, this young Egyptian boy, who's exhausted. He hasn't eaten for 3 days, right? Is that what it said? He hasn't eaten for 3 days. And they bring him to David, and the first thing they do, they gave him bread, and they gave him water to drink, and they gave him cakes of figs, 2 clusters of raisins, which would be my favorite meal, but back then that was customary. So he probably was like, hey, this is great, thank you. And he helps him. And you see just grace on him, because, you know, if they found this Egyptian, they could have taken him as prisoner and said, who are you with? Which he was with the Amalekites, it would have been bad. They could have killed this kid, right? They could have done it and said, especially in their hot anger, like, oh, we're going to return something for you, right? But they don't. They actually show grace. You can see David's heart has changed here. It's like Christ has changed his heart. He went from, we're going to kill, we're going to do all this stuff, I'll fight, to now, hey, let's give the kid some water. Let's give the kid some food. I know he's not in Israel. Let's just help him out. He needs something. He hasn't eaten in days, right? And then David says to him afterwards, he didn't ask first. He asked then, to whom do you belong, and where are you from? He said, I am a young man of Egypt, servant to an Amalekite, and my master left me behind because I fell sick 3 days ago. We had made a raid against the Negev, the Kerethites, and against that which belongs to Judah. And he goes on to tell them that they burn it with fire. What's interesting here, so he says now he's a servant of an Amalekite. He has identified himself. I am with one of those guys that basically kidnapped all your family. And he goes on to say, I was here, 3 days ago I got sick. That's why I'm behind. I got sick, and they, you can imagine, they came in, burnt the place. They don't want to hang out. Like, hey, let's go. Whatever happened, doesn't say why. The guy ends up sick. The young man ends up sick, stays behind. And because of that, they didn't have any food or water. They didn't leave any provisions behind for him, any bread or water. It's almost like they left him for dead, if you think about it. I don't know what would have happened. What would have happened to this Egyptian boy? I don't know. It doesn't even talk about it. It doesn't even consider it. But what would have happened to him if David and his men would have found him? Probably died, because he seemed to be in pretty bad shape here, and he's already sick. But again, I think this is divine intervention. The psychologists call it synchronicities these days, but this is what it is again. Just so happens this Egyptian that just so happened to get sick, just so happened to be left behind, and just so happened to be there and tells David everything that happened, confirming of what had happened, right? And he fills him in that I was actually there and I was a part of this, right? And again, they don't kill him. They didn't kill him, which is great. And he goes on to say, and David said to him, will you take me down to this band? And he said, swear to me by God that you will not kill me or deliver me into the hands of my master, and I'll take you down to this band. So again, it was a divine thing, because we don't know if David would have ever found them, right? Could you imagine if somebody kidnapped your family, they never tell you where they're going? They could end up in Montana, they could end up in Hawaii, they could end up across into South America. You don't know, right? But luckily, he just so happens to find this Egyptian that just so happens to know where the camp's at. So again, you can see God orchestrating this, because who knows if David would have ever found them. We don't know. All we know is God orchestrated it so everything would work out, right? And that's what we're seeing here. This man just happens to be behind, happens to get sick. David happens to help him out, and he happens to know where everybody's at. And he's going to help him as long as he promises not to kill him. And what's nice, you can already see David's already not killed him. So he's been pretty generous now. And David says, no, I'm not going to kill you. Take me to where they're at. This is all a divine appointment, I would call this, a divine appointment. And then the story continues on. This is where David gets to defeat the Amalekites. So when he had taken them down, behold, they were spread abroad over all the land, eating and drinking and dancing, because of all the great spoil they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from the land of Judah. So here, when he says they, they're talking obviously about the Amalekites. What's happening, what it's saying here, they're eating, they're drinking, they're dancing. They're having this big, giant victory party. Wherever they're at, and again, they stole everything. They got out of there. They went to their camp. They think David and all of his guys are still up north. They can't believe they got away, and they're having a party, and they're getting drunk, and they're eating food, and they're dancing, and they're all cheering. It's a big party that's going on here because of everything they got. So you can imagine just the scene here. And again, they're not expecting David or anybody to be around, so they think they've got everything, and they're doing great. And then it says, and David struck them down from twilight until the evening of the next day, and not a man of them escaped, except 400 young men who had mounted camels and fled. So it says here, from twilight until the evening of the next day. So a better way to understand this is basically David and his men come up. You could probably hear, like, imagine showing up, we walk down here down the road and you hear noise and you hear music and there's probably campfires and you look and people are dancing and cheering. They're probably watched from behind the bushes. I can imagine the movies. I don't know if this really happened. But David and his men probably said, oh, here they are. This is the camp. The Egyptian takes them. And they're all getting drunk. And David, don't forget, David and his men are exhausted. So it would be more maybe like to consider that they said, all right, here they are. Let's take a sleep. Let's get some rest. And then at twilight, we'll start killing them. So I'd imagine that David and his men took a little rest here. It doesn't say that, but I think that's more what it's going for here. See, in the evening until the evening of the next day, then it's till they fought them, and it says not a man escaped except 400 young men. So there were a few that fled, but David started killing them and won. And it would make sense again that they'd be wise. If you see there's a drinking party going on, hey, let them have some more wine. Let them have it, because they're going to be a lot less handy with that sword, right? So I can imagine it was probably a slaughter. They were probably stumbling over themselves, probably still drunk from the party or what's going on, and David and his men just went and cleaned house, and the people that had enough, it was probably like one of those parties where the police come and break it up, and some of them ran, 400 ran, and the rest got slaughtered, right? The rest got taken over, and that's how that happened. And then it says, David recovered all that the Amalekites had taken, and David rescued his 2 wives. Nothing was missing, whether small or great, sons or daughters, spoil or anything that had been taken. David brought back all. David also captured all the flocks and herds, and the people drove the livestock before him and said, this is David's spoil. So how amazing is that? Again, this is divine. Because of what situation? Like, could you imagine? Like, this is a crazy thing to imagine. Like, that's just why I just keep saying it's so divine when you really start logically thinking about this. Could you imagine you go home right now, and you had family and children there, and you get home and your house is on fire, and they're all gone, and all your stuff's missing, your refrigerator's gone, your couch is gone. And then you go down the road all to find out it's all there, you get it all back. Hey, your family's safe, you're good, you get your couch, your refrigerator still plugged in, all your food's still there, bring it on down, we got some stuff to carry it in baskets. Like, could you imagine, like, whoa, how did this work out, right? I would imagine I at least would have had something missing, right, from my spoil, or I would have just been happy to get my wife and kids back, and I would have been okay. But here, God has been so caring and loving and gracious to them, and merciful, I should say, that He has allowed them to get everything back. Right? And what I love about this is it's a really good reflection of how God is with us. There's so many things that we should lose things for what we do. And our sins should really take us into some turmoil. But God in His graciousness, when we repent, He gives us things that we should have maybe lost. Maybe we should never got back. And that's what you see here. David deserved everything he got. He probably would deserve to have this stuff taken from him and have all kinds of awful things happen. But because God loved David, He had mercy on him and gave him everything back, which again Try to find another story in the Bible where a town gets burnt to the ground, people are kidnapped, and they get everything back. I don't know if there is another one. This is the only one I know of. There might be. But I'm telling you, this is really rare, and it shows God's love for David, and it helped through all this, because it could have been a lot worse. But then to make it even better, not only that, he got their spoil. So again, let's go back to the scenario. You go home, your house is burnt down, all your stuff's missing. Then you go and you find it all. Not to mention, now you can take all this other stuff. These old people are gone. Now you can steal the thieves' stuff. Now you actually got extra stuff, right? This doesn't make any sense, right? But again, I think this is a glimpse into God. When you're pet, God can give you more than you can even ask for. It's another, I know it's not a direct, thing here, but it's almost like, hey, David got more. Like, David probably would have been happy to get all this stuff back. Like, that's actually, would have made me ecstatic. But not only that, God gave him abundantly more than what he had before. So you can see God's blessings, and they don't make sense to us sometimes. Why is God so gracious to us, right? Because we wouldn't be so gracious to people the way we treat God sometimes, the way we turn on him, the way we, walk away from him at times, right? But God shows his love and his character right here. That David went from getting robbed and almost having his family murdered to getting them all back, and then getting more than he had before. Blessed with more abundance than he had before, which I think is awesome. Then verse 21 says, Then David came, this is really cool. Then David came to the 200 men who had been too exhausted to follow David, and who had been left at the brook Besor. And they went out to meet David and to meet the people who were with them. And when David came near to the people, he greeted them. Then all the wicked and worthless fellows among the men who had gone with David said, Because they did not go with us, we will not give them any of the spoil that we have recovered, except that each man may lead away his wife and children and depart. So what happens here is, they won the war. Now they finally get back. They get back to Ziklag now, they're getting back to the area now they were at, because they went and killed the Amalekites, and they come back. Remember, there's 200 guys there. Those 200 men were there waiting, and they see, they hear the army coming, and they run out to greet them. So how did it go? How did it go? And David comes out and greets them and everything. And then you have these people, which he uses some not so good terms, wicked and worthless fellows, which goes to show, even though David was a great man, he had an army of 600, he still had some jerks too, right? Some real guys that weren't really godly and had a bad character. And you can see it here. We might even said, like, hey, we're the ones that fought. They should be lucky enough to hit the road. They're lucky that we don't kill them. They should take their family and get out of here. That's their reward, David. Get them out of here. And it identifies them as wicked and worthless because they were thinking really incorrectly. They were thinking that they had done more. And they did go out and fight, and they pushed on. I'm sure they were exhausted too, right? But they were so mad, saying, I did all the work. And think we can do this sometimes too. I did all the work. Why should they get anything? I did it all. They should just be happy that if I even give them whatever, right? So you can see this attitude they have, which is not a right attitude. And David corrects it here. It says, But David said, You shall not do so, my brothers, with what the Lord has given us. He has preserved us and given into our hand a band that came against us. Who would listen to you in this matter? For as his share is who goes down into the battle, so shall his share be who stays by the baggage. They shall share alike. And he made it a statute and a rule for Israel from that day forward to this day. So David has a more godly approach. So look at how these wicked men were looking at it, saying, we went and fought this. This is ours. We earned this, right? And let's back up now in the story. Let's think of the whole time, like, wait a minute. You guys are lucky your whole family's not killed. And you got all your stuff robbed, right? You're really lucky, and God's been really gracious to you. But this is how a human mind can work. Even a good Christian, this can happen to us. All of a sudden, where we pull some accomplishment off in the world, and something really good comes, and all of a sudden we think, wow, that was really good of me. I'm glad I earned this, right? Forgetting that the whole reason we had the ability to do anything good was because of what God did for us. If you have anything good in life and you accomplish anything great and get spoiled or get riches or get some great outcome, the Bible tells us we can't even claim that as our own, because we only have the gifts we have. They all come from above, right? So these men had things out of whack. It was very prideful. Me. I fought. I want. It's mine. It's ours, David. They can go fight somebody else if they want it. This is ours. I worked hard for it. I earned it, right? But do we really earn anything? No. God gives us it all. And I love what David says. David, in the way he talks about this, reminds me in one of the letters that John writes. I can't remember which one it is. Basically, talks about how people always want to be the pastor or a Bible teacher because they can help people because they can't do this. And, they are the only ones that can help people. But the only way you're helping people learn the gospel is if you're teaching the Bible or telling them about Jesus. But what people don't realize is you can be a partner in the gospel in any way. Whether that is giving, whether that's mopping floors, cleaning bathrooms, whether it's, contacting. There's all different ways to help spread the gospel. Anybody can be a partner in the gospel. That's what John talks about. Those who give are just as much as the ones who are preaching. It's not just the ones that are preaching that are saving people. All of you who support the preachers, all that you help, who give, all you who work in the church, all you who do that, everybody's equally there. Pastors don't get extra bonus points for saving people more than anybody else. If you've done stuff for your church and you've done your part with your abilities, you are equal in helping push the gospel, it says, as others. And that's kind of what we're seeing here with David. Is anytime, it doesn't matter if it's just strictly teaching, when you are trying to advance the gospel and you're using your skills and gifts, it doesn't always have to be this one way. And that's what David's saying. Hey guys, just because they weren't the ones out fighting and doing the fighting doesn't mean they didn't help us. Why? Because they were back guarding our town, and that was a job. You guys weren't doing that, right? That was actually one of the jobs, guarding the baggage. Because guys, if they all would have went with us, we could have got robbed again, right? So David is saying, hey, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's not make ourselves better than them and say, oh, you guys were tired and weak. You're the weak ones. No, David says, hey, everybody has a part here, right? And I always love thinking of this, and people point this out a lot. CEOs are always talking about like the big people, and they're the big money makers in a lot of places, a lot of business. But what CEO would have a business if he didn't have maintenance people, if he didn't have workers, if he didn't have front desk workers? Could you imagine if tomorrow Amazon, all the drivers and all the delivery guys said, I quit? And all the people said, I'm done packing this up. Jeff Bezos I'm telling you, his net worth would plummet. It would plummet. Why? Because although he was the mastermind, and the CEOs are usually the mastermind and the vision and they guide or whatever, you can't do anything without teamwork, right? And that is, and when you start saying, well, this is more important than this, and that's a little job, and doing that is not as important as what this guy does, it's wrong, because everybody is needed for the goal to be accomplished. Jeff Bezos would not be a millionaire if he did not have everybody else doing their part with their own little gifts. And that's what David's saying here. David is saying they did a part, they are equal, and by the way, he takes another step further. By the way, guys, this ain't ours. I don't know what you're saying about giving your stuff, right? This is God's. The reason we have this is all because of God, right? You can see how David's mind is completely 180 for good, right? He went from a couple chapters ago in 27 to saying, hey, I'm no good. I might as well get out of Israel. They hate me. I'm going to go live with the Philistines. I don't know what's going to go on, and maybe I'll just fight in their army. To, hey, guys, God's with us. This is God. We're going to help them. They're part of us. And so you can see his attitude has completely changed, and now he's saying godly things, right? And I love it says here that he made it a statute and a rule for Israel from that day forward to this day. So it means before this almost became like, a constitutional amendment to Israel. Hey, by the way, new law, anybody who stays with the baggage gets just as much as the warriors. That's a new law, everybody. So he kind of settled it from here on out and made that the new order. Although, theoretically, it was always there. That was always God's intention, that he needs everybody, right? You can't just have pastors at a church. You need all the people. You need everybody in there to make it work, right? And that's what you're seeing here, that everybody, don't ever let anybody say that you don't have enough gifts for God to make an important impact, because anything you do is important for God when you're using your skills and talents for him. And then here's how it ends, the last paragraph. When David came to Ziklag, he sent part of the spoil to his friends, the elders of Judah, saying, here's a present for you from the spoil of the enemies of the Lord. It was for those in Bethel, and it goes on to list Ramoth, Negeb, Jatir, it goes on to list all these places. And at the end it says, for all the places where David and his men had roamed. So it's really interesting here. So imagine he has a bunch of plunder. He got back more than he ever got. Like, could you imagine, like, just $1 million check dropped on your lap? You'd say, hey, I'm going to feel a little, I would feel generous. Like, cool, I got $1 million. I should help out. And what does he do? I'm going to help all the people that helped me. Because when I was roaming through their land, I probably ate some of their grain. I probably used some of their, their sheep, their cattle. We might have slaughtered some things. Because when they were roaming around, they had to eat, right? And they had to drink water. And you go back in the stories of, I think even when Moses and those guys were walking through the wilderness, sometimes I think the Edomites wouldn't let Moses and them pass through because they didn't want the resources taken. Go around somewhere else. Go around us. And they didn't let them come through because it's resources. Could you imagine just some, 1 million people just said, hey, can we just pass through Sunbury and Shamokin for a little bit and stay in town? It's like, hey, you're going to eat up, where am I going to go for my gas? I'm going to be in line for 3 hours. Like, I can't do this. My restaurants, I won't be able to get my pickup order, right? These kind of things is how people think, right? But that's how it would have been. So I think David is kind of looking back like, hey, my fellow Israelites, I'm letting you know God is with me. He's kind of letting them know, I'm still with you guys. I know I was with the Philistines here, but I'm coming back home, guys, and here's some spoil for you, and here's some for you, and here's for you, and thanks you for helping me. And he starts passing it out to all of his friends, remembering that what he did, and it's almost a token of saying, hey, guys, I'm back. I'm not going to ever fight you. I'm not ever going to fight for the Philistines again. I lost my mind there. I was in a really bad spot, but God's turned my life around. And it's kind of cool to see that he can almost have like a Jesus testimony here in a way. Like, guys, I had a bottoming out. And you can imagine David could be giving a testimony, but we haven't got to his kingship yet. And he could already be giving testimonies in churches if he were around, right? He could already be saying, there was once a time where I doubted God and I had to run away, and he turned it around for me. And he's like, still not even king. So David's story is absolutely amazing when you consider everything he went through. But I love this chapter here because you finally see David turn things around. It's not perfect, right? You know, 2 Samuel, I mean, he has his flaws, as we all know. But it's great to see his head get turned around here. And it's also a reminder to us of, because we know David's not going to be in the right mind always again, but he turns it around mostly for good. But it goes to show you that even the best people can have their doubts and their slip-ups and forget to pray and forget all these things, just like David, who is a man and a king after God's own heart. So another great, interesting chapter there. Does anybody have any comments or questions? Beard.
So isn't it fascinating, leading up to this point, David and his men leading raids from Ziklag to the neighboring enemies of Israel and accumulating wealth and resources, and then they leave, someone else attacks Ziklag and the surrounding areas, taking all that wealth and leaving, and then he recovers it and distributes it around the Israelites in that area, which means some of the stuff that he had originally taken was stolen from him, and he got it back and then gave it away. He's doing all these raids, but he doesn't share it, and then when he has it stolen from him, then he shares it.
That is a really interesting factor, because remember, he was stealing and raiding, and some of the stuff that was stolen from him, like you're saying, was probably when he went around all those places killing all the enemies of Israel and bringing that back. And I'm sure some of that, he stole it from the Amalekites. Some of the Amalekites probably stole it back. Then he stole that, and then he stole more. So a lot of stealing going back and forth, but you finally see a kind heart where, because you don't see when he was stealing all that stuff that he would give it to those Israelites. You didn't see that. Because remember, it was kind of that selfish, sinful, like, we're not talking to God here. I just got to feed these people. We're going to rob. So you can see that there. Now the heart of giving is out there and helping the Israelites. Pastor Brad, you had something.
I just want to make a parallel between verses 21 through 25 with Jesus' parable in Matthew 20 of the laborers in the vineyard. Just because, they have that struggle with, hey, we're all getting paid the same wage, and they're trying to find, like, hey, we did more. It's the same kind of thing where David says they shall all share alike. It's how Jesus ends that story, like, hey, everyone's getting the same wage. Everyone's getting paid the same, which is what you were kind of relating it to, which is the grace that we have from God, who gives us all of these blessings. It's kind of free for all. So, which I just think is cool to see the parallels between both David and then the true and better son of
David. Right. I mean, that's amazing. And actually, you can even say, and that is great, and I love it. It again shows what David did here was godlike, is God ordained, because Jesus himself is teaching this in parables. And then, like I said, John reiterates these kind of things here. And it's really great what Pastor Brad said there, is that, Jesus is the greater, the son of David, the greater son, though, is what he would be. And you can see that reflection here, just like when you read later on in the Bible, you can see some of the things of David in the Chronicles rewritten in a more positive light to reflect more of that Christ-likeness of showing. You can see that here, right? A God of plenty, Christ, who comes and gives abundantly and gives what he has. He did all the work for us, and he gives and includes everybody in it. And I think it is a really important thing. What he's saying is to remember this stuff, because we're all human. Like, I'm sure you guys read it like me when I first read that parable, however old I was, and over and over again. Think, man, I would be a little bit mad. Like, could you guys imagine going into work tomorrow at 8 a.m. and the guy shows up at 3:30, and at 4 you both get paid the same? Could you imagine, right? Who would here be like, hey, we're all working. It was all work, and it doesn't matter if he did it for a half hour, I did 8 hours, all the same. I don't think one of us would say that, right? I don't think any of us would say that. But God is saying here, and I'm not saying that you can, I'm not twisting it and saying, hey, you can show up 30 minutes, well, jobs, it's 8 hours. That is not the case, right? But what we're going to say, because remember, that was all about, I have it, it's mine, God hired them. Jesus is saying in the parable, he hired them at that rate. That was agreed upon. It doesn't matter if you guys worked longer, because the agreement was this for everybody, and I don't have to change. It's my money, right? That's what was going on here. But I think it is a really good reminder to not ever think that you're doing more or less, right? Sometimes we think we're doing more than other people. Like, I can't believe they're not doing this. At least I'm doing this, or whatever. But the same thing, you can also think, and it's more likely the case, you probably think, I'm not as good of a Christian. I wish I could do this more, but I just don't. And they'll get more rewards in heaven than me, but at least I get in, but I'm just not as good. No, you guys are all, like I said, if you're doing anything, any skill you gave, right? That's why we can't all be, that's why there's all those gifts and spiritual gifts, because we don't all have them. And they're not all teaching and preaching, by the way. If you go and read those, right? Gift of hospitality, there's all kinds of things, right? And that's why God created us to need them all. And that kind of goes in here again. So it's a really good reminder, nobody's more important in the kingdom of God based on the work that they do, because all work is good work for the kingdom. So that's great. Great parallel. Any other questions or comments? All right. Well, thank you again, everybody, for coming. Next week, are we going to have next week? I forget. All right, so we'll be back here next week then for 1 Samuel chapter 31. It'll be the final chapter, closing down. Of course, spoiler alert, Saul's going to die, but we already probably knew that. So go ahead, read ahead, and then we'll come back and talk about that next time. Until next time, keep your lamps trimmed and burning.